Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another exciting night of NBA basketball.
With the first pick, the Detroit Pistons select Cade Cunningham from Oklahoma State University.
Chandler again. Oh, what a block by Maxfield! My goodness!
The Pistons are digging in. They got the depth. They got the big men. They got the better basketball team. No doubt about it.
There's Jaden playing the passing lane. Skies a jam. Dynamite dunk, and the crowd loves it.
Pistons need a three, and they have just under 3 seconds to do it. Here's Chauncey Billups. Here it is. He's got it. He's got it. Chauncey Billups hits the three. Overtime. Amazing. On the bounce. Detroit basketball.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the Palace of Pistons Podcast, brought to you by Believe. I'm your host this week, stepping in for Mike Anguilano. It's Eric Johnson. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. And joining me this week is my good friend, Jasper Apollonia. Jasper, we've got some great stuff to talk about this week. Excited to have you here. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing okay. Within another week of losses for the Pistons, but nothing we don't expect at this point. So it is what it is. Just excited to be on here talking about the Pistons, and we might actually have a little bit of developing news on this podcast as well. It remains to be seen since we still have a couple games left in the season, but a big portion of this fan base could have one of their biggest prayers answered coming up here in the next week or so.
Yeah, it does sound like one way or another, shortly after the season ends, we're going to get some information that's pertinent to the direction that the Detroit Pistons are going to go in heading into the 2023-2024 season. But before we get into that discussion, we've got to talk about some stuff that Troy Weaver shared to the public earlier this week. And before we get into that, I want to talk about this week's sponsor. It's, as always, our lovely, lovely sponsor, BetOnline. And BetOnline remains your number one source for all of your sports betting this season. Get analysis of every player, prop, and point at BetOnline. You'll find the latest odds, bracket contests, team matchups, and game trends at BetOnline. BetOnline is your betting headquarters this season and all seasons. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to sign up and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Be sure to use our promo code BLEAV, BLEAV, to receive your bonus. Again, 50% bonus on your first deposit. BetOnline matches. It's a great bonus. Use our promo code BLEAV, BLEAV, to sign up and receive that bonus. BetOnline.ag, where the game starts. Okay, now we can get into our first topic of the show. And, if you would have asked me a couple days ago, as, we kind of start putting stuff together for the show, what our main topic or what the biggest topic was going to be this week, I thought this was really going to be it. But we've got some more stuff related to Dwayne Casey that we're going to talk to a little bit later in the show. But Troy Weaver, earlier this week, released a letter to the fan base, courtesy of Pistons.com and NBA.com, citing the disappointment that the front office and he himself shares with the fan base over the season that has unfolded in the way that it has for Detroit. It's not a super long letter. Really, I think the biggest thing that I took away from it was this following quote. Overall, our players have overwhelmingly embraced the core principle of going to work and competing every night. We are in an excellent spot to upgrade our roster this offseason. We've positioned ourselves for another high draft choice in this year's draft. We have favorable salary cap position, and we'll continue to talk with teams and evaluate trade opportunities as they present themselves. Make no mistake, we are all disappointed with our record this season, but are confident that we continue to be on the right path to success. We appreciate your patience, trust, and loyal support as we continue this journey together. A general manager releasing an apology letter to a fan base, not something I had on my bingo card this season. For not just the Pistons, but I guess the NBA as a whole. Jasper, does this letter coming out from Troy Weaver, does this statement to the fan base in the same season in which Weaver agreed to a contract extension with the Pistons, provide you with any sense of comfort or renewed confidence in what Weaver and the organization is capable of doing moving forward?
I mean, comfort, renewed confidence? No. The way I look at this letter, it's been interesting to me to see kind of the reaction around it, because I've seen a lot of people getting mad at Troy Weaver for some reason. For me, I think it's kind of the base of what's necessary. This was a team that came in. I mean, look, Kate Cunningham went on Zach Lowe's podcast before the season started. I believe it was right either before or after the first preseason game against the New York Knicks, and straight up said that he and the organization were trying to compete for the play-in this year. Obviously, Troy Weaver, he had to acknowledge that Cade Cunningham's injury played a big part in that, and he absolutely did. He said, while the injury impacted the continuity of our team, it also presented an opportunity for growth from others. Rebuilding does not always follow a linear path, and I think that is unfortunately true this case, which is extraordinarily disappointing considering that this team finished with, 22 wins last year? And they regressed this season. So no, it's hard to have renewed confidence in Troy Weaver for stating the obvious. It's hard to feel reassured that a team that missed their best player, yes, for the season, but still had their second best player in Bojan Bogdanovic for the rest of it, and pretty much everybody else. I mean, that's one of those things that's always been interesting to me, people talking about, oh, their record's so bad because they've shut everybody down. Bojan Bogdanovic almost played 60 games this year. Like, they were terrible in the 60 games that he played. So for me, just saying, oh, well, we lost Cade and that's why everything fell apart, that to me does not fill me with any more confidence. That being said, I also don't think it's something that he should be derided for. Okay, yeah, the Pistons were not good this year. Yeah, they lost Cade Cunningham. On the other hand, he's absolutely correct when he says that players like Jalen Duren and Jaden Ivey absolutely grew throughout this season. They are better players now than they were at the beginning. And not just in terms of the things that they showed you at the beginning of the season, but in terms of growing. Jaden Ivey with the passing, with the finishing, with the shooting, most of all, perhaps. Jalen Duren in terms of being a more consistent defender. And in these last couple of weeks, showing up with the passing, showing up with the face-up game a little bit. That's definitely been encouraging. Overall, however, this letter doesn't do much for me. I look at it the same way that I look at previous letters from GMs I've seen. Our not with us co-host Mike Angolano posted one from a couple years ago from the Cleveland Cavaliers, actually from last year, from the Cleveland Cavaliers, with Kobe Altman, basically saying, hey, we did a good job. Things went better. They didn't go as we expected. But don't worry, we're getting Colin Sexton back next year. Colin, we can't wait to have you. So that's kind of how I look at this letter, where it's like, look, it's there for the fans. It's to placate them. I don't look at it as really anything differently than that. Aaron, how about you? Is there anything that you're really taking out from this letter that makes you feel one way or another in Troy Weaver?
Well, I think obviously, make no mistake, this is obviously a form of PR by Troy Weaver and the Pistons. And you get that they're trying to instill confidence in the fan base and where this organization is going, right? They have tickets to sell. They have jerseys to sell. They want fans to feel confident in where this team's going, and that there were some things that happened this season that derailed the Pistons from getting to where they want to be. But when I look at this letter and I read, we've positioned ourselves for another high draft choice in this year's draft, as if that is some sort of selling point, as if that's some sort of success. To me, I don't understand if they're just trying to pick off on those who are so naive to feel like that is a major accomplishment, or if I guess they genuinely feel like that's a success, that they were bad enough that they could secure a top 5 pick. I think that part is what irked me about this letter. I don't necessarily have a problem with Weaver releasing this type of statement. I think it would have came off a little bit more I guess I'm trying to find the proper wording for it, but I guess I would have related to it a little bit stronger if he would have maybe taken a little bit more of the blame and said things didn't work out. We have to be better. We're going to be better. These are some of the things we're going to try to do. It would have been nice if he could have made a comment like, we are, fully entrusted in Dwayne Casey and what he's building with this team. You can look at the exact development of Jaden Ivey, Jalen Duren. Like, I don't know. I don't necessarily have a problem with the letter. I feel like selling people on, it was a success that we were able to lock ourselves into a high draft pick is picking on naive people, picking on fans.
We've positioned ourselves for another high draft choice. That made me laugh. That was funny. Yeah. Yes, folks, we've done the work. We've put in all the hours, and don't worry, we've lost all the games we could.
The Pistons do have favorable cap position, but it's what, 30, 35 million. We're not talking about, a ton of money. There are other teams that have more cap space to work with this summer. And again, as we've talked about on this podcast, not necessarily a draft class, or excuse me, a free agency class where that money's going to do you much benefit. But I understand why Troy Weaver did it. I think this is a vital offseason for him. I think the team has to take a major step forward next season. I think, comfortably speaking, they need to, if they do want to make the play-in next year, if they want to make the playoffs next year, they're going to have to win 40 ball games. And assuming they don't win another game this year, considering they're 21, 22, in their last 22, 23 games, they're going to end with 16. So they have to find 24 more wins next season. And that's not happening just because Cade Cunningham's coming back, just because they're getting a top 5 pick. I think people underestimate how hard it is to win in the NBA when the conversation that I see on Twitter is that, well, the Pistons are going to have Cade and Victor Wembanyama next year, when A, they are not guaranteed the number 1 pick. They are not guaranteed Victor Wembanyama. And B, even if the Pistons did win the lottery and did land Victor, bringing back Cade and Victor is not getting this team from 16 wins to 40 wins. That's where I think there's a disconnect. I think there's a disconnect in some of the fan base believing it's really not, or the Pistons are really not that far off from getting to that playoff tier, because 16 and 40 is a rather significant number. And that's where my concern is. And that's where I feel like Troy Weaver hasn't done a good enough job, because he's going to have to make a ton of moves this season. He is going to have to change a ton of the roster that he's already constructed himself over the past 3 years to get to that team to that point. And if you want to say, well, it doesn't really matter. What if they don't get the playoffs next year? Is that the end of the world? To me, does a GM deserve 5 years of getting to strip the roster down to nothing and do it his way and have nothing to show for it? People feel differently. That's my perspective on it. That gets a little bit off of a tangent from this letter itself, but I also think it's reasonable to share those thoughts, because this letter does talk about how they feel they've positioned themselves for next season and for the future, because I feel like they still have quite a ways to go. Troy Weaver has a lot of work to do before this team is going to be a playoff group.
Absolutely. And we've touched on it many times on this podcast, and we're going to continue to talk about it going into the offseason. There needs to be a lot of changes on this roster. For everything that we've said, for all the complaints we've had about the play style, about the players on the team, the fact of the matter is most of them are not going to be on this team if and when they get good. That's just the reality of it. You're not going to have all these guys on the roster. You're looking at these final few games even. Really, other than James Wiseman, Jalen Duren, and Jaden Ivey, I'm not sure any of these players have a guaranteed roster spot for next year. So those are, I do have to say, things that you have to take into account when it comes into, jumping up 20 wins. It's very difficult, but we have seen it done. We've talked about Cleveland as being a team that's done that. You can talk about Oklahoma City as another team that's done that. They won 24 games last year. They are the 10 seed right now, and they are fighting for 40 wins in the West. So it's certainly feasible. It's absolutely doable. In regards to him not mentioning anybody specifically other than Cade Cunningham, I think that's very purposeful for the same reason that I brought up the Kobe Altman letter. You don't want to mention somebody like Dwayne Casey. You don't want to mention some of these maybe more fringe players because there's a big chance that they're gone. You've lost a lot. And like we've said, there needs to be major roster changes. There's most likely going to be major coaching staff changes, even if Dwayne Casey is back for next year. So when you look at it as a whole, I think he honestly did a pretty good job with this letter in laying out exactly where the organization is, why they haven't succeeded, and also, and this is the number one thing you want to do with a PR release, is avoid future bad press. And I think that he probably did that with this letter as well. Yeah, it doesn't fill me with any more confidence, but I definitely think the messaging is about as good as it can be. And when it's all said and done, that is the reality of the situation. Like, they are going to have to get another high draft pick. They're going to have to listen to trades, and they're going to have to figure out something in free agency. Perhaps those last two things come in play with each other. I'm more than ever, especially looking at this free agency class, and we definitely will do a free agency breakdown podcast at some point. I think especially with this free agency class, you're going to have to explore the sign and trade possibilities, and you're going to have to explore the idea that there's going to be stars that aren't necessarily going to want to be there on the teams that they're on that are going to be available, and it's definitely going to be out there. The same way that Cleveland took that leap to 40 wins by trading for Jared Allen, there's a chance that you're going to have something available like that to you as well. So it just comes down to, again, just it's enough words. There needs to be action going into this next season because, like we're about to talk with our next topic, it seems like the seats are warming up a little bit in Detroit, doesn't it, Aaron? Because following the loss to the Brooklyn Nets on Wednesday, Dwayne Casey made some really interesting, possibly telling comments when he was asked about his future with the organization. He met with Tom Gores after the game on Wednesday night, and that actually delayed him from meeting with the media post-game. According to him, what he said is, we're going to look at everything and meet again after we're all done and see which way we all want to go as far as the organization. He also said that nothing's been decided as far as his job is concerned. And when asked about returning, he said, it would be good, but I want to do what's best for the organization. Whatever Tom decides to do and whatever Troy decides to do, it will be that way. Now, obviously that's the case. The GM and the owner ultimately have more say over the coach's position than the coach himself. That goes without saying. But these are comments that I have not heard from Dwayne Casey, say, last year when the Pistons also finished with a very disappointing record. Aaron, are you reading into these comments at all from Dwayne Casey? Do you feel like this is him kind of signaling that he thinks he's out the door from the coaching position and probably moving up to the front office, like has always been the plan? Or do you think that this is just him, covering his bases since he did meet with Tom Gores after the game and just going through the motions of what happens every year in the NBA? Because let's be real, every season, win, lose, or, well, you don't draw in the NBA, but win or lose, no matter how your season ends, I have to imagine head coaches meet with the GM and the owner every single year in every single organization to see where they're at and where they're moving forward to, correct?
I think these are some of the most telling comments from Casey in really as far as I can recall this season. This is the most defeated he's ever really come off. He does such a great job when speaking to the media of, that coach speak style mentality, doesn't really give into anything going on behind the scenes, any of the emotions of that. He does such a good job of just kind of keeping everything face value, not giving any sort of hint on what's really going on. And I think these quotes were rather telling. I think they were very indicative of his future with this organization is cloudy. And whether you believe that should be the case or not, it certainly sounds like it's that way. I mean, this is, again, the most defeated that I can recall him ever really speaking, at least about, his sort of job security with the organization. But he said he loves coaching. He liked to come back as the coach. I don't know if that's going to be the case. I've certainly knocked Dwayne Casey plenty this year, and not just this year, but I've also said that Troy Weaver's not given him a good enough roster to work with. So I think those two things sort of go hand in hand. And if Troy Weaver's going to be back next year, where does Dwayne Casey fall, right? Some people will say even if Troy Weaver's back, which he's going to be back, even if Troy Weaver is back, Dwayne Casey needs to go. And I don't necessarily disagree with you, because let's face it, Dwayne Casey has had plenty of opportunity with the Pistons. He's the 6th longest tenured coach in the NBA, but he has never held a winning record in his time with the Pistons. He actually has the 2nd lowest winning percentage of a head coach with the Detroit Pistons who's been with the organization for 1 year. Those stats coming courtesy of our rival Detroit Bad Boys in an article that they posted this week, I believe.
Come on, Aaron. No free clout. Come on, man.
No free clout, but we're
no free clout
because I'm reading that from their story, so it's it's fair game. He's had his opportunity, and
Aaron, he's the 2nd longest tenured head coach in the history of the organization. The only one who's been there was there longer was Chuck Daly,
and they've never had a winning season under Dwayne Casey. Again, I think it's not just his fault. Like, the general manager's job is to put together a team that should win, and I don't think that the Pistons have done that outside of the year where, it was Blake Griffin, Andre Drummond, Reggie Jackson, Luke Kennard, and they made it to the playoffs. But by then Blake was hobbled, and they kind of crawled in as an 8 seed, and it was, they were dead in the water from there. But to be fair, it's not like the front office is giving Dwayne Casey great rosters every year to work with.
No, certainly not.
Both sides. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there has to be, it's tough because for me, I've maintained on this podcast, I think Dwayne Casey gets another year. I think that he is as much on the hot seat as any coach can be at this point, without being fired. It's going to be interesting. I have to stick with my gut and say that, Cade Cunningham's injury bought him another season, especially the fact that Troy Weaver got extended. I really have to think that Casey, I just think he got another year. The relationship between him and the front office is really solid. The hard thing there, though, is that if the Pistons are going into next season with the expectation of winning, if they are somehow, by the grace of God, also gifted with Victor Wembanyama on their roster and a healthy Cade Cunningham, I think that it's going to be hard for Troy Weaver to go into that situation, knowing that he himself also is likely on the hot seat going into year 4 with the organization. And then year 5 would be the year after that. If they don't win next year, you have to imagine he's going to be under some incredible pressure. And to be in that situation as a general manager without ever having hired your own head coach, that's got to be a really stressful situation. And I think even if he likes Dwayne Casey, it's going to be really hard if Tom Gores is saying, hey, these wins need to start happening. And they need to start happening now. Would you, as a general manager, be comfortable going down without ever having hired your own coach? That seems really hard for me. And I say this as somebody that's maintained that I think Casey will be back next year. I've never been more unsure of it, however. I'm sticking with it just because I don't like to flip-flop. But, I mean, Aaron, do you see another thing? I mean, like I said,
I think it's
second longest tenured head coach in the history of the organization. The only person who was there longer won 2 championships. So, I mean, Flip Saunders had a damn near 60% winning percentage. He couldn't stick around. Say what you will about SVG, but damn, at least he made it to the playoffs. I mean, they over exceeded expectations in 2015. Say what you will about the rest of his tenure. They absolutely outperformed expectations when they made the playoffs as the 8th seed and won 43 games. There's no question about it. Have the Pistons overperformed expectations a single year with Dwayne Casey in charge? And more so than that, you look at the way that they've been coached. His first season, second season, there was a couple games there where they actually won because Dwayne Casey did a good job coaching. I think about 2020, the game they won against the Suns. Dwayne Casey outcoached Monty Williams in that game. There is absolutely no question in my mind about it. I remember that game. I don't remember a single game this year where I've said, wow, you know what? Dwayne Casey did a really good job with his rotations tonight. You know what? I don't give Dwayne Casey a lot of credit, but I'll give him credit here. He changed up the defense. I haven't had a single game like that. It's been the same stuff. It's been bread and butter all season long. It's been really unimpressive. The coaching display has been like the worst I've seen in his now 5 years, or 4 years here. It's just not been good, straight up. And so I don't have a lot of confidence in his job position at this point. We will see, though. I have to stick with my guns. Aaron, I mean, does that ring true to you as well? Because for me, I can think of a couple of games where Dwayne Casey won them in the past couple of years. Even though the teams were terrible, even though the rosters were horrible, even though they only won 24 games, they at least were able to win a couple of them because they had decent coaching, even if they lost other ones. I can't think of a single game they've won because of their coaching. I can think of multiple games that they've lost. Just look to the 3 games that they've lost this season on the exact same damn play, where it's an end-of-game situation where you have a jump ball, you lose the jump ball, and the other team either gets a putback or gets an open shot. It's happened 3 times this year, Aaron.
Yeah, I think everything related to this season has just been kind of going through the motions is how I'd classify it. It never really seemed like they were going out there and coaching to win or anything like that. And of course, by the All-Star break, he shut everyone down, a few weeks after the break and just mailed it in from there on out. So it's really just been kind of a sense that they're just going through the motions at this point. And Dwayne Casey's not done a good job this year. I think it's a very fair point that you made, that if there is any sort of urgency from Tom Gores for Troy Weaver to get this team into the playoffs, Troy hasn't ever brought in a coach. He hasn't brought in a head coach. He never made that hiring. He was able to tear down the entire roster, but he never got to pick the guy to lead this team. And so I think that's interesting. It's an interesting remark that you made, because that is something that, if Troy Weaver is feeling that pressure from Gores, he might look to and say, haven't given Dwayne a great group every year, but I also know that I'm under a lot of pressure right now, and the wins have to start coming. So do I make these changes? Do I bring in these new roster guys and bring in a new coach to see if there's improvement from the coaching staff and the players, to where even if we don't get to the playoffs, there's enough improvement to where I'm safe for another season and get another year to see it out, and another year to add another piece or to add another couple pieces? I think that's a fair question to ask. And for a general manager that did tear the roster down as soon as he got here, I think that's a fair thought to question. Like, it actually popped into Troy Weaver's mind, like, I haven't got to bring in my guy yet. Now, I don't know who that is. I don't know if Troy Weaver has a coach in mind, a coach in waiting of some sort, but it would make sense if he decided to go that route. Now, for me, I can so clearly see both sides of the argument, because if it were me, I think Dwayne Casey has to go. I think you need new blood, a fresh face. Coaches don't get this long of an opportunity and have nothing to show for it like Dwayne Casey has. I think you have to give a different look. On the flip side, I can also understand that, Dwayne Casey didn't have Cade Cunningham this year. Not that that was getting them to the playoffs, but he didn't have his best player that everything was seemingly built around to coach through. B, I don't think he's been given a roster where you could reasonably expect them to get to 40 wins. Now, could you say, They needed to get the 33, 34, 35. Fine. But he was never given a playoff team. Not in Troy Weaver's era, at least. And that's where, on the flip side, if you said, well, he does deserve another year. He deserves that full season of Cade Cunningham, that added pick, that one more year of cap space. This was the year that was prodigalized to us a couple seasons ago, where it was the 2023-2024 season, the 2023 offseason. That's the year of the Pistons. That's when they're planning to make all their moves. So it's been prodigalized to us for years now that this upcoming year was the year for Detroit to take that step forward as an organization. So does Dwayne Casey get that chance to lead them through? I see both sides. If it were me, I think he has to go. But if the team brings it back, I can at least see why they would say they decided to bring him back.
I'll say this. I think the fact that he has such a good relationship with the front office, and that he's going to be moving into the front office, does make that coaching change a lot easier. Because even if there's players in that locker room who are loyal to Casey, he's going to be a professional. He's not going to badmouth anybody while he's still working in the organization. He's not going to badmouth whoever the next head coach is. And I think it makes that transition a lot easier because you're not actually losing him. He's just moving to a different role. So players that like him, players that, seek out his guidance, leadership, whatever it may be, they'll still have him as a resource. And I do think that if you're Troy Weaver and you're looking at that situation like that, I think that if anything, that just gives you a little extra bonus, really, an extra little reason to be like, you know what, maybe it is time to make that move, because that you're not going to be losing the good things that Casey does bring to your organization by doing so. I'll also say this. In years past, the Pistons have lost a lot of games. And in years past, they've shut down their players at the end of the season. I haven't seen them lack competitiveness like they have this year in the past. I just haven't seen it. And I've seen a lot of people, a lot of my friends, people who don't really pay attention to the Pistons and really only just care about getting Victor. And they go, hey, who cares how many games they lose? Who cares how they lose? It's all about the lottery balls. I do understand that perspective to a certain extent, but the lack of competitiveness in these late season games this year has been really disheartening. It's not that they're losing games, it's how they're losing them. They're losing them in really stupid ways. They're losing them by giving up these leads going into the fourth quarter. They're losing them on broken plays. They're losing them on dumb stuff that doesn't need to happen. They're losing them because of lack of competitiveness. Look at the game they just lost to Oklahoma City. They lost because they lost a jump ball. They didn't defend properly, and then nobody boxed out Jalen Williams on the baseline. That's coaching, period. That's coaching. And those are the type of mistakes that can't be getting made if you're trying to compete. It's not just about this year. If you are bringing Dwayne Casey back next year, even if you get Victor Wembanyama, what does the coaching look like? What does the competitiveness look like? And to me, this is a team that is going through the same motions that the teams in previous years have, where they've shut down their best players at the end of the year, where they haven't played, where they have been trying to purposely lose. But unlike those seasons, there's no competitiveness. They're not playing good, close games. They're not outperforming the roster that's being put there, the lineups that are being put out on the floor. They're underperforming, if anything. And that, to me, is a really big red flag. So if I'm looking at it from the replace Casey perspective, I think that those are two things right there, especially if I'm Troy Weaver and Tom Gores. I'm looking at those two things. I'm saying to myself, the time to make a coaching transition has never been easier.
Well, I think it's going to be something that we learn more about sooner rather than later. Obviously, with the regular season ending in just a few days, the Pistons are going to immediately have an opportunity to start having these conversations, start making these decisions. Don't mean to put you on the spot, but are there any coaching names out there that out to you right now? Or are you just kind of, we need to move on from Casey, the Pistons need to move on from Casey and figure it out after, figure out who's going to replace him after?
No, definitely not. You have to have a couple of candidates lined up, I think, because again, if the idea is to compete, not to re-tear down the roster, it does matter who you're bringing in. You need to have somebody that's going to be able to connect to a really young roster, but also provide leadership. You're going to need somebody that's going to be able to give you something new in terms of X and O's. And that's not the easiest thing in the world to find. I also do believe that this is something that Jeremy Grant's touched on, something that Dwayne Casey's touched on, something that Troy Weaver has touched on. I really do believe that there is a concerted effort in this organization to put, Black people in better positions in terms of the coaching staff, in terms of the front office. And I think that that's a real boon to the organization in terms of the players that they want to get in here. It definitely played for Jeremy Grant. And I wouldn't be surprised if the organization wants to go for a Black coach again. I think that'd probably be a good thing, to be honest. So for me, I look at it like that. Look, obviously, the number one guy who you're thinking of when you go, oh, who does good X's and O's, who's available, who can relate to young guys, I hate to say it, it's Ime Udoka. And while I don't think that he's the guy that they would bring in, because I don't think this is an organization that is courting controversy, God knows the owner has enough of that as is. Just ask his sister-in-law. I do ultimately think that Ime would probably be a little too controversial. So I look at somebody else, maybe Jerry Stackhouse could work, former player just like Dwayne Casey. The problem there is, he's coached Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt's been okay under him, but he's still really inexperienced. He hasn't had an NBA coaching job. Yes, he's had a G League coaching job, but I don't think that's the same thing. So that definitely gives me a little bit of worry as well. I think you can also run back somebody even from this coaching staff. I don't know how popular of a choice he would be, but I think Jerome Allen definitely deserves to have an interview at the very least. And if they wanted to go out of left field, I guess you could bring a retread in if you want to go the Kenny Atkinson route, or God forbid, Mark Jackson. Or if you wanted to go another direction, you could also go for somebody like Becky Hammon. But to me, those don't really seem as reasonable. I would not be surprised to see Jerry Stackhouse and Ime Udoka strongly linked to the franchise, though, if Dwayne Casey is let go. How about you, Aaron? Anybody popping up on your radar, somebody that people maybe aren't thinking of, or is it maybe those people that I just threw out there?
I mean, I think for me, the clear-cut number one choice is absolutely Udoka. You look at the success that he had in Boston immediately with a younger team. Yes, they certainly much better than the Pistons. But what he was able to do and the way that his players to this day still go to bat for him after everything that happened during his tenure, I still think that that's meaningful. I think when you look at clear-cut X and O's success in terms of record, like Udoka certainly is the number one choice. And he's a younger coach, a guy that was previously interviewed by the Pistons before they decided to hire Dwayne Casey. So it's not a guy that the Pistons organization is unfamiliar with. And I believe that Udoka was one of the final three for the Pistons job, if I recall correctly. So I think Udoka has to be considered. And it's the guy that if the Pistons did move on from Dwayne Casey, he would certainly be my number one choice. I think Mike D'Antonio is always a popular name. What he's done offensively is certainly remarkable throughout his career. And he's coached some phenomenal teams. He's worked with some phenomenal guards. Someone that I think would be great to have working and developing both Cade Cunningham and Jaden Ivey. I think Kenny Atkinson's obviously a popular name that you're going to hear, one of those retreaded coaches. I certainly think that he could provide some value. I think Jerome Allen, another name that you mentioned, is a guy that's going to get a look. He's a guy that, if you go on, Pistons Twitter, that's a guy that they talk about a lot in terms of wanting him to be the next head coach. And those are some of the guys that really stick out to me. I guess that's really no one new outside of Mike D'Antoni, outside of what you said. But I don't think this coaching market right now is necessarily booming with a bunch of well-known names. Now, who knows? Who's that next Taylor Jenkins, right? Who is that next assistant coach that's been sitting and waiting for 10, 15 years working as an assistant, a video coordinator, this and that, working his way up, that we as the general public don't really know about, but front offices and executives around the league are aware of, right? We don't necessarily know those names as much as we do these people that have had those opportunities before as head coaches. But those are the guys that stand out to me as of right now, with Udoka being far and away the top candidate for the position.
Yeah, and I'd be shocked if there weren't a couple of people that, aren't just super well known. I mean, look, let's be real. Even in NBA circles, how many people knew Eric Spoelstra before he was hired as the Heat head coach? Not a lot. I would guess even there's a lot of professional writers out there who didn't know who Eric Spoelstra was. But God, you sure would love to have that guy as your head coach. So there's always going to be some, head coaching candidates that are not big known names, that are not super popular, but are really great basketball minds and can absolutely work. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see, a couple of those guys thrown in there as well. I'm certainly not above hiring a coach I haven't heard of before. And, the proof is always in the pudding when it comes to that stuff. With the Udoka stuff, because, again, for me, if I had my pick, if I had to pick the person who, to me, most fits what this team needs from a new head coach, it would be Ime Udoka. I think he fits the role perfectly. The only question comes in there is, considering that he was fired from Boston, considering that he was then not hired by the Brooklyn Nets, and of course we don't know how much the Kyrie Irving situation played into that, do you worry about everything that went down, behind the scenes regarding his firing? Because it still doesn't feel like we've gotten a full story there. It does feel like there's certainly some things that haven't been revealed about how everything went down there. And especially, if the rumors are true about what happened with him and perhaps a front office employee, do you worry about, the Pistons looking at it and saying, no thanks, we don't want to risk the headache potentially?
It's certainly not a situation that you can just look past. Definitely not saying that in any way, shape, or form. But I think that when you look at, the league has not suspended him from coaching. The league has not told teams not to hire him. Brooklyn was going to hire him. They ended up balking on that decision. But there's no legislation or anything like that put in place that says Ime Udoka can't be an NBA head coach. I think it's a matter of he's going to get back in the NBA. It's a matter of when, not if. And when all of this stuff came out with Udoka last year and some of the dust initially began to settle, it was Adrian Wojnarowski who said, probably a year, and then Udoka will be back. And it's been a year. The NBA hasn't pursued any sort of further punishment. We really haven't heard any other information. No other information about that story has really become public. So, if something else deeper happened, we don't really know that. And so it's tough for me to fully say you can look at the situation and still be confident in hiring him. You can't say that because we as the public don't know everything that happened. But I think the league is allowing him to be, a head coaching candidate. If he was going to be with the Brooklyn Nets, I think it's fair game. And in the interest of building a basketball team, in the interest of building a winning basketball team and having a winning coach, Ime Udoka is my choice for the Detroit Pistons.
Yeah, fair enough. And look, we're talking about the reasons why, even with the Cade Cunningham injury, Dwayne Casey might be gone. The fact that Ime Udoka very likely is not going to be available after this season, I think that, if anything, adds more impetus to moving on from Dwayne Casey. You know what I mean? Udoka's already a guy that the organization likes, and you're probably not going to get another chance to get him. And I think that too is, and also I think the question there also comes into, it's what does Udoka want? Does he want to go directly to a championship contender? Because there's a chance he'll probably be able to. So I think that, if anything, is actually probably the bigger cause for concern, at least from a Pistons perspective. But yeah, if you're trying to win, to me, there's nobody that fits the mold better than Ime Udoka. So yeah, we will see. It remains to be seen what will happen with Dwayne Casey, but my guess is, I mean, God, Aaron, the season ends before our next podcast. This is our last podcast before the end of the regular season for Detroit. My guess is by the next podcast, we will have a much better idea of what Dwayne Casey's future with this team looks like.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly see soon enough what the team decides to do. I mean, the offseason begins as soon as the regular season ends for these non-playoff teams. So the Pistons would be wise to make that decision one way or another sooner rather than later. Hopefully we'll have more information on that by next week's show. If we don't, we'll still have plenty more to talk about looking back at the season that was for the Detroit Pistons, no matter how miserable it was as a viewing experience. Jasper, thank you so much for joining me this week on the podcast. Hoping to have Mike back next week. For everyone listening, thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to use our promo code BLEAV, BLEAV, to sign up and get a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit with Bet Online. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will see you all next week back here on the Palace Pistons Podcast.